Chris Paul being traded to the Golden State Warriors is one of the weirdest trades, honestly, that we've ever seen in the history of the league. Someone that has as much pedigree and as much history, not only in the league, but with the Warriors specifically, in Chris Paul, joining this team that very clearly still wants to try and compete with Steph Curry and all those other guys on the roster. How exactly is all of this going to fit? Now, I mostly want to speak to the basketball part of this, but we do have to talk about kind of the ego aspect of this. Chris Paul's made some comments about maybe he's not super excited about being a bench guy. That's going to be something that the coaching staff is going to have to figure out, because in my mind, they made this deal for two reasons. One, they wanted to get rid of the Jordan Poole contract. They wanted to dump that salary. And two, they wanted a player that, while dumping that salary, they could replace Jordan Poole's spot in the lineup, in the rotation with. And Chris Paul accomplishes both of those goals if he's willing to come off the bench. And I'm just going to be as honest and as frank and as upfront about this as I possibly can. Chris Paul has to come off the bench. He does not have a choice. There is no scenario in which Golden State is a better basketball team with Chris Paul starting rather than coming off the bench. When they made this deal, they had in their mind that they have their lineup, they have their five guys, and Chris Paul is going to be the Jordan Poole of this group. Maybe he spot starts in some situations. Guys are hurt, guys are taking a rest day, that's fine. But when they are at their best, when they get to the postseason, Chris Paul will not be a starter on this team. Which, for a guy that has literally never come off the bench in his entire career, that's certainly going to be an adjustment. That is one of the biggest risks of this deal for Golden State. So how exactly is all of this going to work, and why am I so confident in saying that it won't work with Chris Paul starting for Golden State? Now, the first problem that Golden State is trying to solve here is, even in the year that they won the title, they have been terrible after Kevin Durant left. Absolutely dreadful without Steph Curry on the floor. It doesn't matter who else is out there. Clay, Draymond, Jordan Poole, Andrew Wiggins, Kevon Looney, doesn't matter. They have been terrible when Steph isn't on the floor, and they're trying to find a way to specifically keep their offense alive when they don't have Steph out there. And Chris Paul certainly can help that. And it's going to be interesting because they're going to have basically two completely different offenses in my mind with Chris Paul now on the roster. The first is with the starters and or with Steph out there, regardless of whether Paul is out there or not. I do think that Paul will play alongside Steph a good amount. We'll talk about that later. But when Steph is out there, they're going to do their normal stuff. Everybody's going to be running around, coming off screens. They're going to be doing, guard to guard screens, ball screen, whatever they want to do. All their movement, all that crazy running around stuff. They're going to do the Steph offense when Steph is out there. It's the thing that they're best at. It's the thing that they're known for, and it is still their best option offensively. Then, during the regular season, when Steph takes rest games, or when Steph just comes out of the game in general, and Chris Paul is the guy out there without Steph, then we're going to see the Chris Paul offense. Things are going to start to slow down a little bit. We're going to see a lot more ball screen stuff. It's okay that Golden State plays a little bit slower without Steph out there, because they're just trying to buy time anyway. And that slower pace, that more methodical, let's try and find the best shot that we can in the first 18 seconds of the shot clock, that kind of style, that's where Chris Paul is comfortable, and that's fine for Golden State as well, because they're just trying to stay afloat when Steph isn't out there. So you can have Clay in the corner, you can have Draymond setting the screen at the top, you can have Wiggins over here on the baseline or in the opposite corner, and Chris Paul can do Chris Paul things. Run ball screens, shoot mid-range jumpers, all that stuff is totally fine. The thing is, what happens when they're both out there at the same time? How do you kind of merge those two things together? Because of course it would be really nice to have Steph off the ball a ton. And in theory, having someone in Chris Paul that is so good on the ball is a perfect fit alongside Steph. And offensively, that's true. But the reason they can't really have those guys out there a ton normally is just defensively. One, you're way too small, despite the fact that Steph is a better defender and rebounder than most people think. But Chris is he's just not going to be that guy. And it's just a little bit hard to mesh their two different styles. Chris Paul has had moments where he's been a good off-ball player in Oklahoma City with those weird three-guard lineups, of course in Houston alongside James Harden. But at this point in his career, when you're trying to squeeze the last little bit of efficiency and effectiveness out of Chris Paul, forcing him to be an off-ball player when even as an on-ball player, he's really slipped a lot over the last season and a half or so, doesn't really seem like that realistic of an expectation. So when they're both out there, it's going to be just a little bit awkward, and it's going to be a little bit strange, which is why I truly think that in the games that Steph is healthy, Chris Paul's been playing like 20 minutes a game. He's going to be playing almost all the minutes, if not literally every single minute that Steph isn't out there. And then there's going to be a couple of minutes a game where they're going to try and play them together. And then once we get into the postseason, Chris Paul might literally be playing between 12 to 15 minutes a game and just playing when Steph isn't on the floor. I think it's that much of a concern in terms of how those two guys and how those two offenses attempt to fit together, because Chris is not an outstanding off-ball three-point shooter. He's not an outstanding off-ball player at this point in his career. And of course, defensively, he's just old and small. Like, that's just how it is. And I think they made this deal primarily to dump the contract, but secondarily to try and keep their offense afloat with someone, and Chris Paul is still very good as the main offensive guy when Steph isn't out there. But when Steph is out there, they have their lineup. Steph, Klay, Wiggins, Draymond, Looney, and you can take out, Looney, put Draymond at the 5 you want to, and then maybe you can slide Chris Paul in there, or you can put, another shooter and a floor spacer out there that maybe is a better off-ball spacer than Chris Paul. That's their group. That's what they're successful with, and they know that that works for them. And Chris Paul is just here to be the Jordan Poole replacement, essentially. The other part of this is the guy that they try and make, the playmaker and the creator, certainly when Steph is out there, but also when he comes off the floor, is Draymond. Draymond is not Chris Paul, obviously, but stylistically there are some similarities in terms of the other true playmaker guy out there. And at this point in Chris Paul's career, his spacing isn't as bad as Draymond's, but it's not fantastic either. And so how those two guys coexist, I think, is going to be really interesting as well, because there's possibilities there where Chris, Draymond, they're running some kind of ball screen game and it works really well when Draymond's at the 5. But when Draymond's out there with a traditional big, I'm not really sure exactly how that's going to work for Golden State. And my point to all of this is this trade and this deal is much more complicated than it seems at first. First and foremost, I do think that it was a salary dump. I think that was the main benefit. Secondly, I think Chris Paul is going to play much less than most people expect, just based off of his name. And thirdly, the ego part of this is going to be a big deal. If Chris Paul actually just refuses to come off the bench and or throws a fit about it and is upset and doesn't play that well because he's just not a bench guy, it's going to cause problems for Golden State. And I know that there are people watching this video thinking, oh, well, why can't Chris just play in the Klay Thompson spot? Klay's not that good anymore. He's recovering from all these injuries over the years. What's the issue there? Klay's better than you think that he is. Klay is still a good player. He can't guard nearly as well, but offensively still provides a ton of spacing, certainly way above what Chris Paul does. And with the way that the Warriors run their offense, they don't really need, when Steph's out there, they don't really need this on-ball creator guy that's going to be doing a ton of ball screen stuff. They want to do off-ball movement. They want to have everybody running around with spacing. And even if they did want someone to just stand there at the top of the key with the ball while everybody else runs around, they have Draymond. They don't really need Chris Paul for that. And so at the end of the day, I do expect Golden State to experiment with this a lot in the beginning of the season. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's a lineup of Steph, CP3, Klay, Wiggins, and Draymond. And maybe that's going to be a fantastic lineup for them all throughout the season as a small ball lineup. Maybe that's true. Maybe Chris Paul is going to be able to change his game more than I think that he will in terms of being a better off-ball player and shooting off the ball, and he's going to be okay coming off the bench. All that stuff, maybe it's going to be totally fine. But ultimately, I think it's going to be weird. And I think Chris Paul, once we get to the postseason, assuming Golden State is there, they're in the conference finals, and Chris Paul plays 12 minutes or 10 minutes while Steph is on the bench. That's going to be weird. And I don't think that that's where a lot of people's expectations are right now with this trade, but I think that's where they should be. I think that was the goal, is to get rid of the contract of Jordan Poole, to replace him somewhat with some kind of guard, but also with the understanding that maybe it's a little bit of an addition by subtraction situation by just getting rid of the money of Jordan Poole. And yes, getting someone at Paul that can help them when Steph isn't on the floor, but ultimately he's not nearly as big a part of their plans for the season as you might have expected when they made the deal.